come on into the room. All right, I'll get started. You're here for the noon session, Zoning for Equity, a demonstration of town planning and zoning for your fair share housing goals. Welcome. Again, thank you for joining us for the second annual Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. I'm Sean Gio. I'm the Policy Director at the Partnership for Strong Communities. Kaylee Pratt, Senior Policy Analyst, and Chelsea Ross, Deputy Director of the Partnership, are both on this session as well. This year, Partnership for Strong Communities has hosted 3 days of sessions featuring local, state, and national experts leading conversations that explore challenges, share best practices, and coalesce us around critical next steps to address key affordable housing issues in our state. You can join the conversation at hashtag CAHC 2021 on Twitter and follow us on Twitter at PSC Housing if you aren't already. Before we turn to our presenters, I'd like to thank our leading sponsors: the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, Melville Charitable Trust, the Connecticut Department of Housing, Webster Bank, and Rockport Mortgage. We also want to thank our supporting sponsors: Beacon Communities, Capital for Change, CSH, Elm City Communities, Fairfield County's Community Foundation, Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, JHM Group, LISC, National Equity Fund, and Trinity Financial. And lastly, I want to thank our session sponsor, Dakota Partners. So before we move on, just a few housekeeping items. The session is being recorded, and we'll make all recordings available to conference attendees as soon as possible. All participants have entered muted. Please remain on mute unless the speakers asked you to unmute. If you have a technology issue, please select the chat icon in the Zoom control panel and send it in the chat to PSC Zoom meetings, and we'll do our best to assist you. Your speakers will let you know how they'd like content questions to be submitted. With that, I want to turn it over to Roger Maldonado from Open Communities Alliance. Roger.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roger Maldonado. I'm a staff attorney with Open Communities Alliance. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. Thank you to the Partnership for Strong Communities for the opportunity to speak. I'm going to be going first by giving a little background on OCA's Zoning for Equity report that we put out earlier this year. And then Sam Giffin, our policy and data analyst, will be talking about fair share, and we'll be handing it off to John to talk about work that we're doing with him and with a local community group called Talk in Glastonbury. So now I'm just going to share my slides. One moment while I get that going. Very good. Okay. So before I go into zoning for equity, I just wanted to give a little context. This is something I'm sure everyone here is all too familiar with, unfortunately, but housing and land use policy in Connecticut and the nation are steeped in explicitly racist considerations. Redlining is one of the most famous examples that has contributed deeply to our persistent racial wealth gap and ongoing landscape of segregation. Here's an example from New Haven. We also, I'm sure, are all familiar with racial covenants, which, while those were private agreements, they were enforced by every level of government. And again, here's an example from Hartford. So this is something we were all too familiar with here in Connecticut. But zoning itself was implicated directly in this expressly racially charged racist history. We often refer to Euclidean zoning, which is in reference to the 1926 Supreme Court decision that essentially allowed towns to zone, and including cordoning off multifamily housing. But what's often forgotten is that the underlying decision was explicitly racist. You can see it in the language colored below. So zoning was part and parcel of this problem. And it remains part of the issue today. We haven't in any way escaped that legacy. It's no surprise to anyone that Connecticut has an affordability crisis, nor is it news that this is a racialized affordability crisis, with Black and Latino households disproportionately being lower income. And since zoning critically says not just where, but perhaps more importantly, where you can't build affordable housing, that leads naturally to a segregation crisis, with the disproportionately Black and Latino households being pushed to isolated areas. Lo and behold, Connecticut is one of the most segregated states in the country. We can see that really powerfully at the local level, and this is using Open Communities Alliance's opportunity mapping portal. There's a link for it at the bottom. Major tip of the hat to Sam Giffin for his tremendous work on this. So what you're seeing here is the Hartford area. Every dot represents either a Black or Latino household. The light areas are low or very low opportunity. The darker areas are higher opportunity. And you can see pretty clearly how concentrated Black and Latino households are in lower opportunity areas. Unfortunately, Hartford is the rule, not the exception. A staggering 74% of Black households live in low or very low opportunity areas, a comparably high percentage for Latino households, and almost the perfect inverse for white households. This sort of speaks to the double-edged nature of the segregation problem in Connecticut. It's not just that white households live almost entirely apart from Black and Latino households, and that isolation comes with all manner of societal challenges and issues. It's also that where our racial groups are living are entirely disparate in terms of the opportunities that they afford. Part of why this is so concerning beyond just the human cost is that we actually have strong laws on the books in Connecticut ostensibly to address these concerns. The Zoning Enabling Act, Connecticut General Statutes 8-2, has long provided that multifamily housing must be provided for in zoning, including for all residents of the region, not just focused on the local municipality, looking beyond boundaries. Similarly, zoning must promote housing choice and economic diversity in housing, including for lower and moderate income households. And recent amendments in Public Act 2129 have reinforced these obligations by suggesting that zoning must be designed to affirmatively further the purposes of the Federal Fair Housing Act. Speaking of which, I think we all know that the Fair Housing Act was adopted in the wake of the tragic murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But it's also important to know that zoning, exclusionary zoning, is at the heartland of what the Supreme Court has identified as one of the core purposes of that act. Nor is the Supreme Court alone. Our own state Supreme Court has identified long ago that issues concerning intentional discrimination being embedded in zoning are a serious concern. And the Second Circuit, since Inclusive Communities Projects, has struck down zoning on both intentional and disparate impact / perpetuation of segregation grounds. So that's the context. Let's talk actually about zoning for equity. So Zoning for Equity was a report OCA put out in June of this year. It was an in-depth look at the planning and zoning of 12 illustrative towns in Connecticut, 4 each spread across our 3 largest counties. And how were these towns illustrative? Well, all of these towns were deeply segregated on the basis of race. This is true if you were to look at them in a vacuum, or if you were to compare them to the region, the state, or as is the case with Southington here, the surrounding urban municipalities. They were also economically segregated. Specifically, these were towns that were disproportionately wealthy, as shown here by with reference to the poverty rate and median household income. So in other words, these were high opportunity towns that were disproportionately white. The towns also lacked affordable housing. This is true both if you're thinking about the home values of houses for purchase, but more importantly, perhaps, and certainly more of the focus of our report, the rental market. I'd just like to flag for Southbury in particular, it really shows that this issue is at its apex when you are looking at affordable housing that is accessible to families, non-age restricted, and that who are in need of rental housing, not just home ownership opportunities. The goals of our report were to underscore the planning and zoning impediments that we found across the state in an illustrative way, not an exhaustive way. To identify issues with some of the policies that have been adopted ostensibly to promote multifamily and affordable housing, to show how policies build on one another, and that's something I'll come back to in a moment. And of course, to empower advocates and towns themselves to make changes to change our landscape here in Connecticut. So before I go into some slides that go over the core findings one by one, I've listed them down at the bottom of this slide. I just want to underscore the critical point at top. So zoning for equity illustrated the planning and zoning challenges. It was not an exhaustive list. You couldn't just fix either what we had per se in the report or select therefrom to address the problems these towns have. Unfortunately, for decades here in Connecticut, every knob has been dialed in favor of keeping out affordable housing, keeping out multifamily housing. And what zoning for equity really speaks to is a need to flip the table and to make it so that we are doing everything possible to facilitate the development of multifamily and affordable housing. So the first of the core lessons to flag was that you actually can't just look at zoning. Planning really is a critical piece of this puzzle. On the left, you have a quote from the Plan of Conservation and Development for the town of Berlin, which makes clear that the town has no interest in touching its single family areas. Those are sacrosanct. And on the right, you can see a map which shows just how stark a reality that leads to. So it really, and we saw time and again, other instances where planning fed directly into the issues we saw on the zoning side, as one might expect. The second core lesson is that towns impose all manner of bureaucratic impediments in the way of multifamily and affordable housing that they don't for single family housing. Southbury is a really powerful example because it kind of shows both sides of the equation. Two-family housing is allowed as of right throughout most of the residential zones in town. And as you can see in sort of the middle of that table there, Southbury actually outperforms the state in terms of its supply of two-family housing. But all other forms of more than single-family housing are allowed nowhere as of right in the town of Southbury. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the town significantly underperforms both the county and the state in those respects. The other critical piece with this bureaucratic burden process, and part of the bureaucracy obviously includes most commonly special exception or special permit hearings, which involves a public hearing process, is that towns are aware that these processes significantly impede the ability to get housing built. There are some quotes here from the POCDs for Westport and Avon that show awareness of the strong opposition that comes out through these processes. The third core lesson is perhaps the most no-duh lesson of the report, which is that there's just not a lot of land that is made available for multifamily housing in our state. The map of Madison sort of shows that very clearly, with everything above I-95 basically being low or the lowest of densities, single family zoning, with higher density zoning only really below I-95. And it's worth pausing for a moment to say that higher density zoning here means 1 unit per acre or more. So some of that is not high density in any respect. And on the left, you have a quote from the POCD, which ties back to that first lesson, where you see how planning is directly leading to these sort of outcomes. You know, there is a deliberate effort to cordon off most of town. The fourth lesson is something that, you know, I think is talked about a lot and people are aware of, which is that we have a huge problem with just enormous lot and parcel size requirements in this state. Orange is a particularly stark example, with everything in yellow being close to 1.5 acre zoning, almost all of the town. But while this is talked about in the single family context, most often, it actually is something which has implications for multifamily as well. You can see in Berlin that there's just an enormous leap from the lot sizes required for single family zoning to 3 unit or more multifamily zoning in various areas, 19,000% and above sometimes. The fifth core lesson is another pretty, I think, well understood one, which is that density limits are used time and again to police what can be built and to keep out multifamily and affordable housing. Units per acre is the standard example, and we often see density levels that are essentially single family zoning. for multifamily housing, 3 units per acre, et cetera. But there are various other metrics such as units per building or caps for particular zones, et cetera. And these will often reinforce one another. The 6th core lesson was that infrastructure, specifically water and sewer infrastructure, are often weaponized against multifamily housing. Ridgefield is a really powerful example. The map on the left shows the areas where there in blue is existing sewer service, and in the yellow in the right corner, the southeast corner there, where there's potential future service. And it's an almost one-to-one overlap on the map on the right, where there's potential housing opportunity zones identified by the town. What's important to note here is that we've made tremendous progress on the ability through well and septic technology to develop multifamily housing off water and sewer. So the complete and the sort of maps we're looking at here are not just for necessarily, the largest scale of multifamily housing. Even 2, 3 family will often have requirements of attachment to water and sewer. The 7th lesson is that even when affordable housing is provided for or developed, it's often targeted away from the households that are perhaps most in need. Those are families who can not afford to buy or looking for multifamily rental opportunities. And it's worth pausing to say that part of why this is such a huge concern is the research of people like Raj Chetty, which show that integration is and moving to opportunity is particularly critical for children and changing for the better their potential life outcomes. So senior housing, an overemphasis on that, or making it easier to develop senior housing, or only allowing for it in certain multifamily areas is a key example, but there are others. And just at the bottom, I'll note that planning again shows up here, because you'll see towns explicitly saying who they are looking to serve, and who they're looking to serve tends to be people who do not have children, young professionals, empty nesters, etc. The last lesson that to highlight for now is that unfortunately towns to date have often focused on provisions that are inadequate to address the scale of the problem, or at least when they are so overemphasized are grossly inadequate. ADUs is an example where, even if you need people to be willing to build an ADU, not all property owners are going to do that. Then they need to rent it out as opposed to just housing a family member, rent it out to somebody across racial lines in an affordable context, blah, blah, blah. Even Public Act 2129 does not allow towns to require affordability in ADUs. And I think maybe the big point here is that even if everything goes right, ADUs are unlikely to be of help, again, to that core group of lower income families, because by their nature, they're smaller units as associated with single family housing. There are a couple other examples here of home ownership and single family, again, being overemphasized when that can't really reach as deeply as multifamily or rental opportunities. Just to close on this, the critical point is not that these are harmful per se. It's that they've occupied the lion's share of towns' efforts in a way that, despite being not the most robust by any stretch of imagination, remedies to the problem. And they can reinforce the single family status quo. The last point I'll make is that there were also some more unique but not entirely isolated problems that we saw along these lines, such as in Madison, where one of its core affordable housing provisions contained a residency preference. Madison is, I believe, on the verge of 91% white. So it's not altogether surprising that if you take, even if affordable housing were to be developed, at a great scale under this provision, if you're giving first crack at that housing to households that already live in the area or in the town before those that live outside, that's going to cause major issues in terms of implications for the integrative potential. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Sam Giffin.
Thank you so much, Roger. Can everyone see my screen? Thumbs up or a nod? Great. And I just want to make note that I think perhaps the best way to ask questions would be to come off mute when we have a question and answer period, but I think you can also put them in the chat and we'll try to get to those as well. So with zoning for equity, we confirmed some of our suspicions, at least about those 12 towns, that zoning and planning are providing myriad impediments to affordable housing and multifamily housing. But what do we do with that? Well, at OCA, we believe there's an enormous amount that can be done at the local level, but that ultimately, to change exclusion into inclusion in these towns, we have to use state policy. So towns have had decades to make progress on affordable housing, and many have made little meaningful progress over the last several decades. But not all state policy is created equal. What exactly should state policy do, and how should it approach this issue? Well, we believe first and foremost, it has to change the incentive structure for towns. Right now, essentially, there's an incentive, despite the law that Roger cited, to do as little as possible, to try to fly under the radar, to try to tout meaningless progress or minor progress, as Roger discussed with the ADU policy, and to basically hope that you don't get sued under the law that currently exists. So that has not been working. We have thought a long time at OCA for many, many years about what would make an affordable housing policy meaningful in our state. And these 4 principles we think are key. So meaningful affordable housing goals means having actual numbers of units that are tied to the state's actual need for affordable housing. These should also be realistic, but they should be ambitious. They should not be based on what Connecticut has done for the past 30 years or longer, a period during which this problem has gotten so much worse. We should think about what the next 30 years could look like, the next 20 years, the next 10 years, the next 100 years. Any meaningful solution is probably going to look out of the ordinary for Connecticut. So universality, this is as much about a political strategy as it is about the policy. But it basically means that every town has a part to play, and not an equal part, but an equitable part, meaning that a state policy addressing this issue equitably would have an equitable distribution of affordable housing that each town must provide for. Flexibility is a pragmatic aspect of policy. And by that, I'm referring to not being too specific in the prescription for any given town as to what they should be doing. So as we learned, among many things in our zoning for equity research, there is a lot of complexity in how zoning regulations and planning can impede affordable housing. They can work together, they can work in tandem, they can work separately. They can relate to specific on-the-ground conditions of a market or a zone or even a parcel. The sub-market conditions. Therefore, if we mandate simple, specific zoning changes or specific planning directives, for example, a blanket upzoning, the impact could be marginal because of other factors on the ground. There could be ways that savvy towns work their way around making those changes impactful, such as, we can use more setbacks, we can use aesthetic regulations, we can use parking, we can use impervious coverage, density caps, all sorts of manner of zoning provisions that can mitigate the success of any blanket specific zoning mandate. Finally, zoning enforceability is probably the most critical piece and the one that is the most glaringly missing in our state. So towns often talk about the desire to maintain control over the process and maybe that they support affordable housing, but just not this time or not in this way, not in this specific route or not this specific piece of policy. But towns have demonstrated a lack of compliance with state laws, requiring encouraging multifamily, requiring economic diversity and meeting the regional need. So the state has to step in if towns continue to abdicate this legal responsibility. So OCA has settled on fair share as the policy that best represents these critical aspects of state legislation. And we presented our fair share policy at the last Affordable Housing Conference last year and introduced as legislation in the last legislative session. But I'm going to go over each tenet of this, how this responds to those critical pieces of legislation. There's a lot more, I just should say, on our website, more specifics at ctoca.org/fairshare. But basically, fair share starts with the understanding of how much housing is really needed in our state. So recall that obligation that Roger talked about, the towns have to provide housing opportunities for all residents of the municipality and the region, referring to the Regional Council of Government region, or the RCOGs. So we look at a conservative definition of regional need, that is how many households are extremely low income and severely cost burdened. For reference, that is households at 30% of the area median income, paying half their income towards housing costs, which for most of the state is about $30,000 a year in income for a family of 4. So we consider that very conservative because it ignores household need from 30% AMI to 80% AMI, and also ignores the just regular cost burden of households paying over 30% of their income towards housing costs. While it's conservative, the statewide need is 135,000 households that fit that description, which would be an unprecedented increase in affordable housing production in the state. So while it's conservative, it is also unprecedented. Here's a map of the regional need for affordable housing by Regional Council of Government geography. Note that the Western and Metropolitan Regional COGs are combined to be more in line with the size of COGs throughout the state. Not surprisingly, you can see that there's the greatest need in our most populous metro areas. And this, applies the most sound planning, regional planning, that we shouldn't simply distribute affordable housing where there isn't the need. So the next tenet of fair share is universality, so equity, not quality. And this is the core ethic of fair share. But it's also a major political selling point. Every town is obligated to do their part. And so we are much more likely to achieve success with producing a large amount of affordable housing. This is a lesson that we learned from New Jersey, where towns very frequently opposed their fair share obligation. Then they said, well, how much does my neighbor have to do? And they found out that it was as much or greater than they did. They found that there was logic behind the fair share obligation assigned to each town. And they were much more positive on the prospect of completing their fair share. The next tenet of our fair share proposal is flexibility. Again, this is both a policy decision, but a political feasibility question. Towns have countless policies, programs, and housing types that they could utilize to achieve their fair share. This spans anything from single-family affordable home ownership to larger scale mixed income housing. So this allows towns some agency in achieving their share. It also doesn't allow them to circumvent highly specific zoning mandates. And it is more politically, perhaps feasible for that reason. And now finally, the most critical aspect, we believe, is enforceability. So what we've learned from other states where there has been limited success, specifically California, is that enforceability is absolutely critical. California had something similar to a town and regional fair share planning requirement since the 1960s. However, the policy allowed towns to use the complexity of a town's zoning and other methods to ensure that that zoning change that they're planning did not create affordable housing, and not much actually yielded from that policy over the last 50 years. Until in 2017, the state passed a law allowing state ministerial approval of affordable housing developments if a town was shirking their responsibility. So towns have the option under fair share to choose their own destiny. They can make a plan, they can ensure that their plan works and be on their way to a more diverse and economically vibrant future. But if town plans are like they were in California, designed to fail, the plans can be challenged in court. And if towns fail to create a plan at all, if they're simply bad actors, there is a builder's remedy, meaning that a court could approve an affordable housing development as long as it's within the state public health code, state building code, state environmental regulations. So as we've seen in the case of New Jersey, the vast majority of towns have come to the table throughout the state, wealthy suburbs, segregated places. They've developed plans to achieve their fair share obligations, and it's led to a massive increase in affordable housing throughout the state on the order of approaching 100,000 affordable units. So that's sort of the high level description of what fair share is and why we believe it's the best policy moving forward. It has been our pleasure to work with John Guszkowski of Tyche Planning and Policy Group to actually see what it might look like to execute a fair share policy on the ground in one town. And we've done that in collaboration with Truth in Action with Love and Kindness, a citizens group in Glastonbury. And I'm going to turn it over to John to talk about his process.
Okay, thank you, Sam and Roger. And it has been our pleasure as well to be involved with this project. Let me just swap that view. Are we good on screen here? Good, thank you, Roger. So as Sam said, my name is John Guszkowski. I'm a principal with Tyche Planning and Policy Group. We're a relatively new, relatively small, but scrappy group of planning and zoning practitioners based in Connecticut and working primarily for Connecticut communities. Over the past couple of years, we have, well, over the past couple of decades, we've done work all across the state, focusing primarily for town-based work in the eastern 2/3 of the state. And in the last year, year and a half, we've become very, very active in working on affordable housing plans, which are required by Connecticut General Statute Section 8-30J, working with communities as diverse as the little town of Hampton of 17 or 1,800 people, and the city of Waterbury, over 120,000 people. So we've had a lot of experience on the ground with a variety of communities thinking and talking about expanding opportunities for affordable housing. And so we were very excited when we were approached by OCA to help with this effort in Glastonbury to really kind of take a boots on the ground approach of what a fair share plan execution strategy would look like in one of Connecticut's communities, and specifically in Glastonbury. As Sam detailed a bit, the affordable housing plans that are currently required by the state are extraordinarily broad and vague and do not hold towns' feet to the fire about anything. It basically requires municipalities to come up with a plan to increase their number of affordable housing development, period, by 1, by 10, by 15%. It really doesn't matter. The statute doesn't say. And it's kind of a recipe for, an unenforceable sort of broad brush approach that municipalities aren't necessarily incentivized to take all that seriously, which is quite different from the fair share approach, which is also quite flexible, as Sam said, but does set a numerical target. And so what we were charged with as part of this exercise is to take the town of Glastonbury and the fair share percentage calculated through OCA's methodology based on New Jersey. And the fair share number is 1,550 units, and that is a 10-year number. And those units have to be affordable. It's not just we need to grow the housing number in Glastonbury by 1,500 over the next decade, but these are affordable units. These are fair share units. And so what we were asked to do is basically figure out how to get to that number using programmatic and policy changes. And so what were the action steps? What could we do in Glastonbury over the next decade to get to that number? And again, because this hasn't been done in Connecticut before, and we basically had sort of New Jersey as a model, and there wasn't really any proof of concept. We had to make a couple of assumptions when we did this work. And number one is that the market demand would be there. That we basically had to do, I wouldn't say necessarily magical thinking, but assume that the market would be there to absorb these new housing units. Because as Sam said, there is well over 100,000 unit demand, a need in Connecticut. So we assumed that if we made these properties available through regulation, through construction, they would be absorbed into the market. Glastonbury has a limited area of public sewer and water. We assumed that those utilities would be available and that we're not particularly resource constrained right now, and that could be extended within reason. We certainly didn't want to assume that the entirety of Glastonbury's 50 plus square miles would be fully sewered and fully public watered. So we focused our highest density assumptions on those areas that did have public utilities. This was 1,550 is a big number, and a decade is a remarkably short period of time, and so we weren't looking to create a single solution. We're not going to build a large 1,500 unit apartment complex on 120 acre property and call it a day. This is not sort of a Cabrini Green solution, but we were going to look at a broad combination of actions and policies to try to get to this number. And then further, as I believe Roger was talking about with accessory apartments and things like that, there are policies that the town can change, and the policies that the town should absolutely change, but that don't necessarily redound to that bottom line of fair share, simply by allowing accessory apartments, which is something that Public Act 21-29 is essentially recommending to almost requiring municipalities to do. It doesn't necessarily create affordable housing. It creates, potentially more housing opportunities. But, so some of these actions are good to do just in and of themselves and don't necessarily get to that fair share number. So we started, in addition to reading through the town's policies and zoning regulations, subdivision regulations, we started with GIS mapping, and my colleague Rachel Burstein was very useful in putting together some of these queries. And one of these was a sort of a test of market uptake. And so we basically took a look at areas that were zoned single-family parcels, larger than 2 acres, that were unbuilt upon and that had access to public sewer and water. So if you sort of figure that out, these are basically high density, public utility access areas that have not been built upon. And in the entire town of Glastonbury, in the sewer and water area, there are only about 10 total parcels that have not been built upon that have access to public sewer and water, which is a remarkably low number. And what that tells us is that, number one, Glastonbury is an attractive market. And if you provide the opportunity to develop and have those public utilities, those properties get snapped up and they get developed. And so it was a little bit of proof of concept of the market demand in Glastonbury. One thing that we did find very interesting is when we did that search, again, relatively undeveloped properties of larger than a couple of acres with sewer and water, we came across this piece of farm property on Addison Road, which is more than 33 acres. It is an old farm property that's not in intensive use and is entirely separated by high density development, both commercial and residential. And it has access to public sewer and water. And it's so, we're certainly not looking to do, again, all 1,500 units in one spot. But if you were looking for something like that, there are opportunities where you have very large tracts of land in very high density areas with access to public sewer and water, where you could build a tremendous new community of mixed income, of affordable. And there is great potential in Glastonbury, and it's just sort of a matter of identifying properties and coming up with approaches for beginning to look at some of these ideas. We also did some GIS analysis of properties that were within 500 feet of public sewer and water lines. As we said, if we were looking at properties that were already served by public sewer and water and had not been developed, there's a relatively small number of them. But if you expand your search area and assume that the sewer and water development envelope could be expanded just a bit, just 500 feet, less than 1/10 of a mile, you open up a whole lot of new opportunities, and over 170 vacant residential parcels become available within less than 1/10 of a mile of existing public utilities. So a little bit of public infrastructure investment would unleash a tremendous amount of available properties for higher density development in a market, again, especially as attractive and popular as Glastonbury. And so what this also would allow us to do is assume a much broader distribution of housing opportunities, because we can cover a whole lot more development ready parcels over a course of 10 years and over the town's geography. So we made a series of recommendations in kind of three general categories. The first is those regulation changes, which again don't necessarily redound to the increase of affordable housing numbers in a fair share sense, but are incredibly important sort of fundamental building blocks of what Glastonbury ought to be doing to address kind of its fundamental unfairness when it comes to housing opportunity. So number one, particularly in unsewered areas, which is pretty much the eastern 2/3 of the town of Glastonbury, you have areas that, as Roger said, are extremely large lot, are 1.5, 2, or even larger minimum lot size, with really no objective justification for that other than sort of amorphous, pointing to community character or something like that. And so what we would propose is a much more objective standard, which is basically public health code. If you don't have sewer lines, but your soils are such that you can process wastewater with a septic system on less than 2 acres, well, then you ought to be able to do that. And so we're recommending no minimum lot size in unsewered areas, which is called soil-based zoning, as well as eliminating Glastonbury's current minimum building size, which for residential areas is somewhere between 11 and 1,300 square feet. So if you're going to build in Glastonbury a single family unit, there is this minimum size, this minimum price of entry that sort of artificially makes Glastonbury unaffordable to small home buyers and small home builders. And so we would, unfortunately, Public Act 21-29 codified that and required municipalities to eliminate their minimum lot size or minimum building size. So Glastonbury would certainly need to conform to that. As we discussed already, the accessory apartments, Public Act 21-29 allowed them as of right, but it did allow municipalities with a 2/3 vote of both Planning and Zoning Commission and the Town Council or Board of Selectmen to opt out of that as of right accessory apartment statute. We would certainly recommend in the case of Glastonbury that they do not opt out and in fact embrace the new state law to allow for accessory apartments and secondary units as of right across the town in all residential zones. As well as allowing for middle density housing, which is basically 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 unit multifamily housing to exist on single family lots in such a way that basically mimics sort of large lot, large home construction approaches that we've seen in many suburbs like Glastonbury, and allows for a higher density and a more diverse set of housing opportunities in the context of suburban residential densities. And again, all of these things are important changes that don't necessarily create restricted affordable housing that would count towards your fair share number, but they start to tilt the balance back to a more fair and equitable opportunity in Glastonbury. So in addition to those zoning changes, we would also recommend several new policies, the first of which is inclusionary zoning, which is Section 8-2I of the Connecticut General Statutes, which is a piece of enabling legislation that basically allows municipalities to require developments of a certain size to include a number of affordable units or a minimum percentage of affordable units. It allows municipalities to require that or require a fee in lieu of setting aside those affordable units that a town can put into a affordable housing trust to construct units somewhere else. And a few municipalities, primarily along the Gold Coast and in Fairfield County, have started adopting inclusionary zoning. And it's something that a wealthier, high market demand community like Glastonbury should certainly include as a way to mandate that any new construction should include some affordable component. In addition to incentivizing the income restrictions on accessory apartments. So once people begin to realize that they are allowed to have accessory apartments or in-law suites or accessory dwelling units, however you want to put that, as of right, we would want to put in some opportunity and incentive for homeowners to, or the owners of these units, the landlords of these units, to make them available to people at the lower end of the housing spectrum on a minimum of a 10-year basis, and to create basically an incentive through tax abatements or administrative support to encourage people to do that and not just, make them available at market rates to whomever. The town does have a current zoning process called Planned Area Development, or PAD, that does allow multifamily development in certain areas of town on certain minimum lots in certain circumstances, but that tends to be restrictive and really not particularly high density development. We're talking, 3, 4, 5 units per acre, which is a pretty low number for higher density multifamily. And so we would want to adjust that and to make it easier to do planned area developments, which is basically multifamily in more areas, and to specifically target high opportunity properties. And putting all those policies together, and we won't get into the sort of the cookbook and number crunching here, but we estimated that those changes over a 10-year period could result in between 350 and 500 fair share points over the course of the decade. And then the third set of recommendations we made were really about Glastonbury and state and federal government really putting their money where their mouth is in terms of encouraging fair housing and encouraging affordable housing. And they could take several forms, but they do involve actual dollars on the table. A couple of them are about subsidizing either rental properties or paying down the purchase prices or closing costs and purchase support for either rental or homeowner situations, where it would sort of echo things like CHFA or USDA purchase supports. Or it would work with existing renters, existing landlords of multifamily units to reduce their rental costs for renters and make those units available for affordable housing renters, while making the landlords whole with some subsidies, similar to vouchers and things like that the town would be active in that. The town could certainly be an active participant as a developer or as a partner, because there are a number of town-owned or controlled parcels, particularly within access to sewer and water, where the town could reduce development costs by making these municipally controlled properties available at low or no cost to developers, who could then create multifamily units on them, affordable units, and pass those savings on as to their renters. Certainly the town has an active and very good housing authority, but they focus primarily on sort of the traditional senior and disabled type housing. They should certainly increase resources to the housing authority and funding, so that they are able to take on more development projects. And a lot of this is not necessarily just about the town spending its money, but it's about town leveraging its resources with state and federal funds that will hopefully be available with the Build Back Better and state investments in affordable housing that the town could leverage. And then other opportunities is about being opportunistic and taking a look at reuse of commercial properties. And what we've seen, particularly in the aftermath of COVID, is that office space is less and less attractive and less used as a resource, because people are getting used to and enjoying working from home. Fewer people are finding the need to go into the office, and the demand for office space is shrinking. So this property that you see on the photo here is on, I believe, Western Boulevard or National Boulevard in Glastonbury, and sort of the section of Northwest Glastonbury where you have a bunch of office parks. This is a 60,000 square foot office building that is less than 50% occupied and is currently on the market. We found these photos on LoopNet, which is a commercial real estate site. That 60,000 square foot building is available for less than $6 million, which is less than $100 a square foot, which is probably less than half the cost of construction of a new office building or any type of building. So the bottom line there is this is an incredible bargain for somebody. And if we allow developers to look at these commercial properties, these office properties, and say, okay, the town would like to see or would allow housing to go there, it expands the opportunity for developers to create affordable housing, which is encouraged and perhaps even demanded by the community at numbers that can work, that can pencil out because of the reduction in market demand for office buildings. And so combining those investments together, we were looking at another estimated 500 to 750 units. And I will say that our final report, our final analysis is still in process. And so, when the report comes out from OCA and from TAHC, we'll do a little bit more of showing our math on this stuff. We're kind of giving you the big picture numbers right now. But some of the lessons we've learned from this, the challenges is that it's hard to get to 1,550, and we respect OCA's ambition here, because that demand is clear. That 130 or 140,000 units across the state is truth. It's not an exaggeration. It's a number we need to get to. The trick is, communities like Glastonbury, and Glastonbury is certainly not unique in this, is that they've been segregationist and they've been exclusionary for decades, and Fair Share approach is looking to kind of fix that or reverse it in a relatively compressed time. So it's a big number. It's ambitious. It's not impossible, but it's a challenge. And I think probably the biggest challenge that Pam Lucas and Ann Bowman and the good folks at TAHC are going to have to be focusing on is what is the sell? How do we convince Glastonbury to buy in on this or to embrace this? But those are opportunities because they are the TAHC folks like Pam and Ann and their colleagues are very cooperative, very collaborative, very driven, and they have their hearts and minds in the right place. And that's really important to have on the inside of one of these communities. Glastonbury particularly is a very good market. I mean, Connecticut in general has been a little bit sluggish, as we know. But Glastonbury has shown that it is a hot market for housing, particularly. And it provides a challenge like this. It provides an opportunity for Glastonbury to really step out front and be a leader in equity and housing affordability. So we think that there is a lot to be optimistic about as well. And so we really look forward to continuing to work with OCA and TAHC and the folks in Glastonbury, as well as the legislature in this upcoming session when Fair Share is going to be back on the table. And we are appreciative of the opportunity to work on this project. So there's my contact information, and I will stop sharing and turn it back over to Sean, I guess.
Thanks so much, John. I think we have a few minutes left, about 5 minutes left for questions. There have been some questions in the chat. I don't know, Sam or Roger, perhaps you were following any of them that you'd like to take a shot at addressing.
Sure. So thank you for everybody who's contributed questions. I think Aaron Boggs, our executive director, responded to the first question from Michael Woolby. And then I saw another question from Carol Martin about the use of ARPA funds for expanding sewer systems into new residential neighborhoods. Obviously, we think that's at OCA that's a big opportunity, and that there's a long history, unfortunately, in the state of deliberately, as I sort of touched on in my presentation, keeping sewer out of areas as a way as an excuse for not developing multifamily housing. That said, at the same time that it is a great opportunity, that doesn't mean that we should stop efforts to promote off sewer or off water multifamily housing, which is absolutely something that can be accomplished given modern well and septic.
And I would only add that there are other funds. There are lots of state funds that have been available over time for development of infrastructure that could support higher density housing, but also that this is sort of the reason why we believe a whole scale or a holistic approach is necessary for towns, because that can be part of town planning that leads to the fair share. It can't simply be specific zoning mandates.
Well, John, there was a request from Charlie Adams, if you could put up your contact info maybe in the chat. I have a follow-on question, I guess for John or maybe for any of the OCA folks about, John, you talked in your analysis about some of those policies like inclusionary zoning is, essentially the subsidy is coming from the developer, right? But for a lot of the other policies, there's going to be need to be some sort of form of public subsidy. Have you had a chance, or do you think there's a way to model what some of those costs might look like, given your recommendations in Glastonbury?
Yeah, we went into this a little bit in some of the analysis that we're preparing. Basically, assuming, and we did this for a sort of a rental pay down, looking at the delta between a market rent for a standard apartment in Glastonbury and what an affordable rent would be, and say that delta is $200 or $300 a month, and then so we basically came up with our fair share number by assuming a level of investment by the town over 10 years. Let's say it's $5 or $10 million. And kind of dividing that into how many $200 or $300 a month rental subsidies could we provide to existing property owners. And so some of this is in the realm of assumptions, but that's how we sort of constructed our numbers.
Thanks, John. Well, we're just about on the hour, so I will wrap up now and thank our presenters, Roger, Sam, and John. And I hope everyone found this as interesting and exciting as I have. I'm looking forward to seeing how the Fair Share Plan progresses as we move forward. The next session is going to start in a minute, and it is unlocking energy and money savings through energy efficiency and solar. So thanks again, and thank you guys again for your presentation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for having us.